Have you ever watched someone get laughed at for doing something no one else understood, only to realize later that they were the only one who saw the truth? What if I told you that in the autumn of 1944, deep in the Hurtgen forest along the German border, an entire platoon of American soldiers owed their lives to a dog that everyone had dismissed as defective? A dog whose handler was ridiculed, mocked, and nearly court-martialed for refusing to give up on an animal that the United States Army War Dog program had already classified as unfit for service? Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from right now. And if you have not subscribed yet, please hit that button. This channel survives because of people like you who help us share these incredible stories that history tried to bury. Your subscription means everything to us. Now let me take you back to a moment that changed everything. The morning of October 17th, 1944, started like any other in the dense woodland that American soldiers had already begun calling the Death Factory. Second Lieutenant Marcus Jennings of the 82nd Infantry Division stood at the edge of a muddy clearing, watching his men prepare for another day of what had become an unending nightmare. The Hurtgen forest stretched before them like a wall of darkness, its ancient trees so thick that sunlight rarely touched the forest floor. The Germans had turned this natural fortress into a killing ground, and American casualties were mounting by the hour. But Lieutenant Jennings was not thinking about the Germans that morning. He was thinking about the handler standing 20 feet away, a young private from Biloxi, Mississippi, named Cornelius Wheeler, and the American shepherd at his side. The dog was called Sergeant, though most of the men in the company had other names for him, names that could not be printed in any newspaper. Sergeant was an 18-month-old American shepherd with a coat the color of Georgia clay and eyes that seemed to look through things rather than at them. He had arrived at the front 3 weeks earlier as part of a war dog replacement shipment, and from the very first day, something about him had been different in a way that made experienced soldiers uncomfortable. Private Wheeler had noticed it immediately. Where other scout dogs would work in straight lines, following scent trails with methodical precision, Sergeant moved in patterns that seemed almost random. He would stop in the middle of a patrol, turn in circles, then suddenly bolt off at a 45-degree angle from whatever direction the company was heading. He would freeze for minutes at a time, staring at nothing, his ears rotating like radar dishes picking up signals that no human could hear. He would dig at the ground in places where there was nothing to find, then ignore obvious tracks that any trained dog should have followed. The Army evaluators at Fort Robinson had noted these behaviors in Sergeant's file. Words like erratic and unpredictable appeared multiple times. There was even a recommendation that the dog be removed from the program entirely and returned to civilian life. But a shortage of trained scout dogs in the European theater had kept Sergeant in service, paired with Private Wheeler almost by accident when his original handler was killed during the Normandy landings. What no one understood yet was that Sergeant was not broken. He was operating on an entirely different level of perception. Captain Raymond Holbrook was the first officer to formally complain about the dog, a career military man from Austin, Texas, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that lined the hill country back home. Holbrook had no patience for anything that deviated from standard operating procedure, and Sergeant deviated constantly. "I have seen a lot of dogs in this war," Holbrook wrote in a field report dated October 3rd, 1944. "Good dogs, brave dogs, dogs that have saved American lives. This animal is none of those things. Its behavior is unpredictable at best and dangerous at worst. I have personally witnessed it abandon a clear enemy scent trail to chase what appeared to be nothing through heavy underbrush, causing our patrol to lose valuable time and nearly walk into an unmarked minefield. I recommend immediate removal from active duty." But Private Wheeler refused to give up on Sergeant. In the letters he sent home to his mother, he tried to explain what he was seeing. "Mama, "The other handlers think I am losing my mind," Wheeler wrote on October 12th. "But I am telling you there is something special about this dog. The way he moves, the way he stops and listens to things that are not there yet. I've started keeping notes on his behavior, and I'm starting to see patterns. He is not random. He is not crazy. He is reading something that none of us can read. I just have not figured out what it is yet." The discovery that would prove Wheeler right came 5 days later, on that cold October morning when the entire company was preparing to push deeper into the forest. The mission was straightforward, at least on paper. Intelligence had reported that a German supply line was operating somewhere in their sector, and Battalion Command wanted it found and destroyed. The company would move in a standard patrol formation, with scout dogs working the point to detect enemy positions before the main body could walk into an ambush. There were 3 dogs assigned to the patrol that day. Sergeant was supposed to be held in reserve, but the handler for one of the primary scouts had come down with dysentery overnight, leaving the company short. Captain Holbrook had argued against using Sergeant at all, but Lieutenant Jennings overruled him. They needed every asset available. "Private Wheeler, I'm going to give you exactly 1 chance," Jennings told him before they moved out. "Keep that dog under control. The first time he starts acting up, you pull him back and let the others work. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, sir," Wheeler replied. "But with respect, Lieutenant, you might want to keep your eyes on Sergeant today. I have got a feeling about this one." Jennings did not know what to make of that comment. He would remember it for the rest of his life. The patrol entered the forest at 0700 hours. The Hurtgen in October was a cathedral of death, its towering pines blocking out the sky while their needles created a carpet that muffled every footstep. Visibility was measured in feet, not yards. Sound traveled strangely between the close-packed trunks, making it impossible to tell whether a noise came from 10 meters away or 100. The Germans had learned to use this acoustic distortion to devastating effect, positioning machine gun nests in locations where their fire seemed to come from everywhere at once. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The 2 primary scout dogs worked the point in alternating shifts, their handlers reading their body language for any sign of enemy presence. Sergeant walked beside Wheeler in the middle of the formation, occasionally pulling at his leash but otherwise behaving himself. Then, at approximately 0830, Sergeant stopped. He did not just slow down. He planted all 4 feet and refused to move, his entire body going rigid. His nose was not working the air the way a tracking dog should. His head was tilted at an odd angle, and his eyes were focused on something deep in the forest to their left, perpendicular to the direction they were traveling. Wheeler felt the hair on his arms stand up. He had seen Sergeant do this before, many times. It was always the prelude to one of his erratic breaks, the behavior that had gotten them both labeled as liabilities. But this time felt different. There was an intensity to the dog's stance that Wheeler had never witnessed before. Sergeant was not confused or distracted. He was certain, absolutely, completely certain about something that Wheeler could not see or hear or smell. "Private Wheeler, get that dog moving," Captain Holbrook hissed from behind him. "We do not have time for this." Wheeler looked at Sergeant. The dog had not blinked, had not moved a muscle. His focus was absolute. Something about this one, Wheeler thought, remembering what he had told Lieutenant Jennings that morning. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think we need to check this out." "What are you talking about?" "There is nothing there. The scouts already cleared this sector. With respect, sir, Sergeant is indicating something. Strong indication. I have never seen him like this." Holbrook's face reddened. "That dog does not indicate anything except his own confusion. Now move." But before Wheeler could respond, Sergeant did something he had never done before. He lay down, flat on his belly, chin pressed to the forest floor, eyes still locked on that invisible point in the trees. And then he began to whine, a low, keening sound that made several nearby soldiers reach for their weapons instinctively. In the language of war dogs, this posture meant only one thing: extreme danger ahead, do not proceed. The problem was that Sergeant was pointing in a direction the patrol was not even heading. He was warning them about something off to the side, something that none of the other dogs had detected, something that by all logic and training should not have been there. Lieutenant Jennings pushed forward through the formation until he reached Wheeler and Sergeant. He looked at the dog, then at the handler, then at the impenetrable wall of trees where Sergeant was focused. "Private," he said slowly. "Are you sure about this?" "No, sir," Wheeler admitted. "But I have been working with this dog for 3 weeks, and I have never seen him do anything like this. Whatever is out there, he is absolutely certain about it." Jennings was silent for a long moment. The patrol had stopped moving, and he could feel Holbrook's impatience radiating from behind him like heat from a furnace. Everything in his training told him to trust the primary scouts, to follow standard procedure, to dismiss the behavior of a dog that had already been flagged as unreliable. But something in Wheeler's voice made him hesitate, and something in the dog's eyes, that absolute, unblinking certainty, made him decide. "Sergeant Costa," he called quietly, "take 4 men and do a reconnaissance sweep in that direction, 200 yards, then report back." The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. Moving off the planned route in the Hürtgen forest was dangerous. The Germans had been fighting in this terrain for months, and they knew it intimately. Every deviation from the path risked walking into a trap. But orders were orders. Sergeant First Class Dominic Costa selected his team and began moving in the direction Sergeant was indicating. They had covered perhaps 50 yards when Costa suddenly held up his fist, signaling the halt. Through the trees, invisible from the patrol's position, he had spotted something that made his blood run cold. He was back within 3 minutes, his face pale beneath its coating of forest grime. "Sir," he whispered to Lieutenant Jennings, "we have a major problem. Report." Costa swallowed hard. "There is a ravine about 150 yards in that direction. Deep, maybe 30 feet, running parallel to our planned route. The Germans have fortified it. I counted at least 40 men, sir, maybe more. Machine gun positions, mortars, the whole setup. They are positioned to hit us from the flank the moment we advance past this point." Jennings felt his stomach drop. The patrol's planned route would have taken them directly past that ravine, with their left flank completely exposed. The Germans had set up a perfect ambush. They were just waiting for the Americans to walk into the killing zone. "How the hell did our scouts miss this?" Holbrook demanded, his earlier impatience replaced by cold fear. "They were checking our forward route, sir," Costa replied. "The Germans positioned themselves off-axis. They knew exactly where we would be looking and set up where we were not." Jennings turned to look at Sergeant. The dog was still lying flat, still focused on that distant point, still absolutely certain. "Private Wheeler," he said slowly, "how did your dog know?" Wheeler shook his head. "I do not know, sir. I honestly do not know." But Cornelius Wheeler had his theories. In the days that followed, as the story of what happened spread through the division, he would share them with anyone who would listen. "I think Sergeant hears differently than other dogs," he told a Stars and Stripes reporter who interviewed him a week later. "You know how bats use echoes to navigate? I think Sergeant does something similar. He picks up on sounds that bounce off things, sounds that tell him where objects are even if he cannot see them. That ravine was like a big acoustic reflector. Every sound we made, every footstep and clinking canteen, was bouncing off those walls and coming back to us. To human ears, it just sounded like forest noise, but to Sergeant, it was like a map. He could hear the shape of the land itself." The reporter had been skeptical. "That sounds more like science fiction than military training." Wheeler had just shrugged. 3 weeks ago, I would have agreed with you. But I watched that dog save 47 American lives today by hearing something that was not there yet. You tell me what is fiction and what is real. The immediate aftermath of the discovery was controlled chaos. Lieutenant Jennings called in artillery support, and within an hour, the German position had been reduced to smoking rubble. 23 enemy soldiers were killed, 15 more captured, and the supply line that intelligence had been looking for was found running through a series of tunnels beneath the ravine. It was one of the most successful operations the division had conducted since entering the forest. And everyone wanted to know about the dog. The legend of Sargent began to spread that very night. Men who had mocked Wheeler and his crazy tracking just hours earlier were now asking to pet the American shepherd, to have their pictures taken with him, to hear the story of how he had detected the ambush. Captain Holbrook, who had recommended Sargent's removal from active duty, quietly destroyed his own report and wrote a new one, praising the dog's exceptional abilities. But what happened next would prove that the events of October 17th were not a fluke. They were just the beginning. Over the following 3 weeks, Sargent would lead American forces to 12 more hidden German positions. Each time, his method was the same. He would stop, orient himself towards something invisible, and refuse to move until his warnings were heeded. And each time, investigation would reveal enemy forces exactly where the dog had indicated. By November, Sargent had become something unprecedented in the history of military working dogs. He was no longer assigned to a single company, but was rotated between units as a specialized asset, brought in whenever commanders suspected they might be walking into a trap. His reputation grew with every success. But so did the mystery surrounding his abilities, because Cornelius Wheeler had been right about one thing. Sargent was not working like other dogs. He was operating on principles that no one fully understood. The army began sending specialists to study him. Veterinarians, animal behaviorists, even a professor of acoustics from MIT, who'd been drafted into the Signal Corps. They ran tests, took measurements, analyzed his behavior patterns, and what they found challenged everything the military thought it knew about canine capabilities. The closest thing I can compare it to is echolocation, the MIT professor, Dr. Harold Simmons, wrote in a classified report. But that term does not fully capture what this animal is doing. He is not generating sounds and listening for their return, like a bat or a dolphin. Instead, he appears to be processing ambient sound in ways that give him spatial information far beyond normal canine perception. He can apparently detect the acoustic signatures of terrain features, man-made structures, and human presence at distances of several hundred yards, in conditions where visibility is near zero. I do not fully understand the mechanism, but I can confirm the results. This dog perceives the world in ways we cannot measure. The report was stamped, classified, and filed away. But copies circulated among senior officers, and Sargent's value to the war effort was now beyond question. What no one could have predicted was how the Germans would respond to this new threat. By late November, enemy intelligence had identified Sargent as a priority target. Intercepted communications revealed that the Germans had been tracking American patrol patterns and had noticed a correlation between successful operations and the presence of a specific handler and dog team. They did not know exactly what Sargent could do, but they knew he was responsible for the destruction of multiple carefully prepared ambush positions. The order came down from a German regimental commander on November 28th. The American scout dog, designated as a priority threat, was to be eliminated by any means necessary. Assets were allocated, plans were drawn up, and a specialized team was assembled for the task. They called it Operation Stille Jagd, the silent hunt, and they were not just hunting a dog, they were hunting the man who understood him. The first sign of trouble came on December 2nd, when a German prisoner captured during a routine patrol revealed something that sent chills through the American chain of command. There is a price on the dog, the prisoner told his interrogators through an interpreter. 10,000 Reichsmarks and an Iron Cross for whoever kills it. But there is an even bigger reward for the handler. They want him alive. Alive? Why alive? The prisoner had shrugged. They want to know how he trained the animal. They want to do the same thing with their own dogs. There are people in Berlin very interested in this. Scientists. They believe the dog has abilities that could change the war. The information was relayed to Lieutenant Jennings, who immediately ordered increased security around Wheeler and Sargent. But in the chaos of the Hurtgen Forest campaign, with casualties mounting daily and resources stretched thin, there was only so much protection that could be provided, and the Germans were patient. They watched. They waited. They learned the patterns of American patrols, the rotations of security personnel, the moments when Wheeler and Sargent were most vulnerable. The attack came on December 9th, 1944, at approximately 0300 hours. Wheeler was sleeping in a dugout near the battalion command post, Sargent curled at his feet as always. The night had been quiet, the forest wrapped in the kind of stillness that came before heavy snow. Sentries were posted at regular intervals around the perimeter, but visibility was near zero, and the cold had slowed reflexes and dulled alertness. No one saw the German infiltration team until it was too late. There were 6 of them, all volunteers from a Fallschirmjäger unit that had been decimated in earlier fighting. They moved through the American lines like ghosts, using the same acoustic principles that made Sargent so effective, the ability to read sound and silence, to find the gaps in perception where a man could pass unseen. They reached the dugout at 0312. 4 of them took up positions around the entrance, while the other 2 moved inside, their weapons ready, their orders clear. Take the handler alive, kill the dog. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed that Sargent's abilities only worked when he was awake. Private Wheeler would later describe what happened next in a letter that was never sent, found among his personal effects and preserved in the National Archives. I was dreaming about home, he wrote, about the smell of my mother's biscuits and the sound of the screen door slamming in the summer breeze, and then Sargent was on top of me, his teeth at my throat, not biting, but pressing, the way a mother dog carries her pups. I knew immediately that something was wrong. I reached for my sidearm just as the first German came through the entrance. What followed was 30 seconds of violence that would be studied in military training programs for decades afterward. Wheeler fired twice in the darkness, hitting the lead infiltrator in the chest. Sargent launched himself at the second man, 70 pounds of American Shepherd, driving into the German's midsection and sending him crashing backward into his companions outside. The noise alerted the sentries, who began firing into the confusion, and within moments the entire camp was awake and responding. When the firing stopped, 4 of the 6 Germans were dead. 1 was critically wounded, and 1 had escaped into the forest, carrying with him the knowledge that the mission had failed. Wheeler had a bullet graze across his left shoulder. Sargent had a knife wound on his flank that would require 12 stitches, but they were both alive, and the story was far from over. In the days that followed, as Wheeler recovered in a field hospital and Sargent was treated by veterinary staff, the implications of what had happened began to sink in. The Germans had mounted a special operation specifically to capture a dog handler and kill his animal. This was not normal warfare. This was something else entirely. Lieutenant Jennings visited Wheeler on December 12th, 3 days after the attack. He sat beside the hospital cot and spoke quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Private, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Yes, sir. The Germans wanted you alive. They were willing to sacrifice trained soldiers just to take you prisoner. Do you have any idea why?" Wheeler was silent for a long moment. Then he reached beneath his pillow and pulled out a small leather notebook, its pages covered in handwritten notes and diagrams. "I have been keeping records, sir, of everything Sargent does, every behavior, every reaction, every time he detects something that no one else can perceive. I have been trying to understand how he works." Jennings took the notebook and began flipping through its pages. What he saw made his eyes widen. Wheeler had documented over 200 separate incidents of Sargent's unusual perception. He had mapped the dog's reactions against terrain features, enemy positions, weather conditions, and time of day. He had developed a system of notation for the different ways Sargent communicated danger, distinguishing between imminent threats, distant presences, and what Wheeler called acoustic anomalies, sounds that did not belong in a given environment. Most remarkably, Wheeler had begun to develop a theory for how Sargent's abilities worked, a theory that would not be validated by science for another 50 years. "I think he perceives sound the way we perceive light," Wheeler explained. "We see colors because our eyes detect different wavelengths. Sargent hears shapes because his ears detect different patterns of reflection. To him, the forest is not just a collection of sounds. It is a three-dimensional map made of echoes." Jennings stared at the young private from Mississippi, this farm boy who had barely finished high school before being drafted into the largest war in human history. And he realized that he was looking at something extraordinary. A man who had learned to see the world through his dog's ears. "Private Wheeler," Jennings said slowly, "I think we need to have a conversation with some people above my pay grade. That conversation would happen sooner than either of them expected, because the Germans had not given up on Operation Stillejagd. They had simply changed their approach, and what they planned next would push both man and dog to the very limits of what either could endure." The report that arrived at battalion headquarters on December 14th contained information that would alter the course of the entire campaign. German radio traffic, decoded by a signals intelligence unit operating out of Luxembourg, revealed that the enemy was preparing something unprecedented. They were bringing in their own dogs, not ordinary war dogs, but animals that had been subjected to experimental training programs developed by scientists working for the Reich. Programs designed to replicate whatever abilities the Americans had developed in their miracle dog. And they were coming to the Hürtgen forest to prove that German science was superior. The date was set for December 16th, a major offensive that would become known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. But in those final hours before the storm broke, in the frozen darkness of the Ardennes forest, a different battle was about to be fought. A battle between two dogs and the men who understood them. A battle that would reveal secrets about animal perception that would not be fully understood for another half-century. And a battle that would leave scars, both visible and invisible, on everyone who survived. The snow began falling at midnight on December 15th. By dawn, it had transformed the forest into a white cathedral of silence, muffling every sound and obscuring every landmark. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet, and the cold became a living presence that seeped through every layer of clothing and penetrated to the bone. Private Cornelius Wheeler stood at the edge of the American perimeter, Sargent at his side, both of them staring into the white void that had swallowed the world. Something was coming. They could both feel it, but neither of them could have imagined what that something would be. The German offensive began at 05:30 on December 16th, 1944, with an artillery barrage that shook the frozen earth like the fist of an angry god. Shells screamed through the snow-laden air, exploding among American positions with devastating precision. Trees that had stood for centuries were shattered into splinters. Foxholes became graves. And through the chaos, through the fire and the screaming and the death, something else was moving, something that Sargent detected before anyone else. He began behaving strangely approximately 10 minutes before the first shells fell. Wheeler noticed it immediately. The dog was not orienting toward the German lines, where any rational animal would have focused. Instead, he was turning in slow circles, his ears rotating independently like twin satellites searching for a signal. His whine was different too, higher-pitched and more urgent than Wheeler had ever heard. "What is it, boy?" Wheeler whispered, kneeling beside the dog in their shared foxhole. "What are you hearing?" Sargent's response was to press his body against Wheeler's legs and begin trembling. Not from cold, not from fear. from something else entirely, an overload of sensory information that his canine brain was struggling to process. And then Wheeler understood. There were other dogs out there, dogs like Sergeant, dogs that had been trained or perhaps modified to perceive the world in the same impossible ways, and they were communicating, not with barks or howls, but with something subtler. Subsonic frequencies that traveled through the ground itself, vibrations that human ears could never detect, but that Sergeant was receiving like a radio picking up a distant broadcast. The Germans had brought their experimental animals to the battlefield, and those animals were hunting. The first hour of the offensive was pure chaos. American lines buckled under the weight of the German assault, and units that had been holding defensive positions for weeks found themselves suddenly surrounded. Communication broke down, chain of command fractured. In the swirling snow, it became impossible to tell friend from enemy, and men died in the confusion, shot by their own comrades, or simply lost in the white void, never to be seen again. Wheeler and Sergeant survived that first hour through a combination of luck and the dog's extraordinary perception. 3 times, Sergeant pulled Wheeler away from positions that were about to be overrun. Twice, he led his handler through gaps in the German advance that no human eye could have detected. And once, in a moment that Wheeler would remember until his dying day, Sergeant attacked a German soldier who had appeared out of the snow, barely 10 feet away, his rifle already aimed at Wheeler's chest. The dog hit the man at full speed, 70 pounds of muscle and fury driving him backward into a snowdrift. Wheeler heard the German's rifle discharge harmlessly into the air, heard the man's scream cut short as Sergeant's jaws found his throat. And then there was silence, broken only by the distant thunder of artillery and the soft sound of snow falling on the bodies of the dead. By noon, Wheeler had linked up with a small group of survivors from his original company. There were 11 of them in total, including Lieutenant Jennings, who had taken shrapnel to his left arm, but was still capable of command. They had established a defensive position in the ruins of a bombed-out farmhouse, its stone walls providing some protection against the elements and the enemy, but they were surrounded. German forces had pushed past them on both flanks, and the only reason they had not been discovered yet was the snow that continued to fall, erasing tracks and muffling sounds. It was only a matter of time before a patrol stumbled across their position. "We need to move," Jennings said, his voice tight with pain. "If we stay here, we die." "Move where, sir?" Sergeant Costa asked. "The Germans are everywhere." Jennings looked at Wheeler and Sergeant. The dog was lying in the corner of the ruined farmhouse, his eyes closed but his ears still moving, still tracking sounds that no one else could hear. "Private Wheeler," Jennings said, "can your dog find us a way out?" Wheeler knelt beside Sergeant and placed his hand on the dog's flank. He could feel the animal's heartbeat, faster than normal but steady. And he could feel something else too, a vibration that seemed to run through Sergeant's entire body, like a tuning fork resonating with frequencies from far away. "He's picking up something," Wheeler said slowly. "Multiple sources. Moving. German patrols?" Wheeler shook his head. "I do not think so. The pattern is wrong. These are not random movements. They are coordinated, systematic, like a search grid." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir, I think they are using dogs. Dogs like Sergeant, and I think those dogs are looking for us." The silence that followed was absolute. Every man in that ruined farmhouse understood what Wheeler was saying. The Germans had developed their own acoustic perception animals, and those animals were hunting them specifically. "How is that possible?" Costa demanded. "How could they know about Sergeant?" "They have known for weeks," Jennings replied grimly. "Remember the prisoner we captured, the one who told us about the bounty? The Germans have been studying us, studying our dog, trying to figure out what makes him special. And now they have created their own version. Or worse," Wheeler added, "they might have had the research already. Sergeant might not be unique. He might just be the first one we found." The implications of that statement hung in the air like poison gas. If the Germans had been developing acoustic perception dogs independently, if Sargent was not a miracle, but simply the American discovery of a technology that both sides had been racing to develop, then everything they thought they knew about the war was wrong, and the enemy might be far ahead of them. "We cannot stay here," Jennings repeated. "Wheeler, I need Sargent to find us a route. Can he do it while avoiding the German dogs?" Wheeler looked at Sargent. The dog had opened his eyes and was staring at his handler with an intensity that seemed almost human. There was something in that gaze, something that Wheeler had never seen before. Understanding, purpose, and beneath it all, a grim determination that mirrored what Wheeler himself was feeling. "He can try, sir, but I need everyone to understand something. If there are really other dogs out there like Sargent, dogs that can hear the way he hears, then they might be able to detect us too. Every step we take creates sound, every breath, every heartbeat. To those animals, we might as well be screaming. Then what do we do?" Wheeler was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out the leather notebook that contained all his observations of Sargent's behavior. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. "There is something I have been working on," he said. "A theory about how Sargent processes sound. I think he does not just hear echoes. I think he can predict them. He knows what a sound should sound like before it happens, and when reality does not match his prediction, he knows something is wrong. What does that mean for us? It means that if we can control our sounds, if we can make ourselves predictable, we might be able to slip past the German dogs without being detected. We would have to move in a very specific way, same pace, same rhythm, same intervals between steps, like a metronome." Costa laughed bitterly. "You want us to march through a blizzard in the middle of a German offensive, stepping in perfect time like a parade drill?" Wheeler did not smile. "I want us to survive, Sergeant, and right now this is the only idea I have." Jennings looked at his men. 11 soldiers, wounded and exhausted, surrounded by an enemy that had developed weapons they did not understand. The odds were terrible, but the alternative was worse. "We will try it," he said. "Wheeler, you and Sargent take point. Everyone else, follow exactly in their footsteps. Match their rhythm precisely. No talking, no coughing, no unnecessary movement. We are going to walk out of here like ghosts." And so they did. The journey that followed would become the stuff of legend among the survivors of the Battle of the Bulge. 11 American soldiers and one extraordinary dog, moving through a frozen hellscape in perfect synchronization, their footsteps falling in a rhythm that Wheeler had calculated based on Sargent's acoustic predictions. They walked for 6 hours through the blizzard, past German positions, past burning vehicles, past the bodies of men who had not been as fortunate. 3 times, Sargent stopped and indicated danger. Each time, Wheeler adjusted their rhythm, changing the tempo of their march in ways that the other soldiers did not understand but followed without question. And each time, whatever threat Sargent had detected passed them by, oblivious to the Americans hiding in plain sight. But it was the 4th detection that nearly destroyed them. They were perhaps 2 miles from the American lines when Sargent froze in a way that Wheeler had never seen before. The dog did not just stop, he collapsed, his legs giving out beneath him, as if all his strength had suddenly drained away. His eyes rolled back in his head, and a sound escaped his throat that was unlike anything Wheeler had ever heard. A keening, desperate howl that seemed to contain frequencies both above and below the range of human hearing. "Something is wrong," Wheeler said, kneeling beside the dog. "Something is very wrong." And then they heard it, all of them. A sound that should not have been possible. It was a dog barking, but not from any single direction. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding them, penetrating them, vibrating in their chests and skulls. It was not loud exactly. It was pervasive, inescapable. A wall of acoustic information that overloaded the senses and made it impossible to think. "What the hell is that?" Costa shouted, his hands pressed against his ears. Wheeler understood. The Germans had not just created dogs that could perceive like Sergeant. They had created dogs that could project, animals that could generate sounds designed to overwhelm and disorient, to break down the acoustic camouflage that Wheeler had so carefully constructed. They were being jammed. "Run," Jennings ordered. "Everyone run. Forget the rhythm. Just move." They ran. Through the snow, through the trees, through the chaos of a battlefield that had become a nightmare of sound and fury. German soldiers appeared out of the blizzard, drawn by the commotion, and the Americans fired as they fled, not aiming, just trying to survive. Wheeler carried Sergeant in his arms, the dog still conscious but unable to stand. Whatever acoustic weapon the Germans had deployed had done something to the animal's nervous system, overloaded his extraordinary perception in ways that Wheeler could not understand. But he was not going to leave his dog behind. Not after everything they had been through. The American lines appeared through the snow like salvation. Wheeler could see soldiers in familiar uniforms, could hear English being shouted, could smell the coffee and diesel fuel that meant safety. They were 50 yards away, then 40, then 30, and then something hit him from behind. He went down hard, Sergeant, falling from his arms into the snow. Wheeler rolled onto his back and found himself staring up at a German soldier, a young man with wild eyes and a knife in his hand. Behind the soldier, barely visible in the swirling snow, was a dog. Not like Sergeant. This animal was larger, darker, with eyes that gleamed with an intelligence that seemed almost artificial. It was standing perfectly still, watching, and Wheeler understood that it had tracked him. Through all his acoustic camouflage, through all his careful calculations, this creature had found him anyway. The German said something in his own language. Wheeler did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Triumph, victory. The hunt was over. And then Sergeant moved. Wheeler would never be able to explain what happened next. His dog, who had been incapacitated moments earlier, who could barely stand, launched himself at the German shepherd with a ferocity that defied explanation. The two animals collided in an explosion of fur and teeth, their bodies tangling as they fought with primal intensity. The German soldier, startled by his dog's sudden engagement, hesitated for just a moment. It was enough. Wheeler pulled his sidearm and fired twice, hitting the man in the chest. The soldier fell backward into the snow and did not move. But the dogs were still fighting, and Wheeler could hear, even with his merely human ears, that something terrible was happening. The German dog was making sounds that seemed to distort reality itself. Frequencies that made Wheeler's vision blur and his thoughts fragment. It was attacking not just with its body, but with its voice, using acoustic weapons that had been bred or engineered into its very being. Sergeant was losing. "No," Wheeler said. "No." He raised his pistol, but he could not fire. The dogs were too tangled together, moving too fast. Any shot he took was as likely to hit Sergeant as the enemy. And then, in the midst of that impossible battle, Sergeant did something extraordinary. He stopped fighting. The German dog, sensing victory, lunged for Sergeant's throat. But Sergeant was not surrendering. He was preparing. In the fraction of a second before the German's jaws could close, Sergeant unleashed a sound of his own. Wheeler felt it more than heard it. A pulse of pure acoustic force that seemed to originate from somewhere deep inside Sergeant's chest. It was not a bark or a howl or anything that could be described in normal terms. It was a weapon, a frequency designed to disrupt and disorient, to turn the German dog's own perception against it. The German shepherd recoiled as if struck by an invisible fist. It staggered backward, shaking its head, suddenly blind and deaf to everything around it. And in that moment of vulnerability, Sergeant struck. It was over in seconds. The German dog fell into the snow and did not get up. Wheeler ran to Sergeant's side. The American shepherd was barely breathing, his coat matted with blood both red and dark. His eyes were open, but they seemed to look at something far away, something that Wheeler could not see. "Easy, boy," Wheeler whispered, gathering the dog into his arms. "Easy. You did it. You saved us all." American soldiers surrounded them moments later, providing cover as medics rushed forward. Wheeler heard voices asking questions, demanding explanations, but he could not respond. All he could do was hold his dog and pray. Sargent survived, barely. The military veterinarians who treated him reported injuries that they could not fully explain. Damage to his auditory system, certainly, but also something deeper, something neurological. Whatever weapon he had used against the German dog had cost him. He would never hear the same way again. The army transferred Sargent to a rehabilitation facility in England, and Wheeler went with him. They spent the remaining months of the war together, away from the front lines, while scientists and doctors tried to understand what had happened. The leather notebook that Wheeler had kept became a classified document, studied by experts who were only beginning to comprehend its implications. The German acoustic dog program was never fully recovered. The animals and their handlers were scattered by the failed offensive, and most of the research was destroyed as the Reich collapsed. But fragments survived. Documents found in abandoned laboratories suggested that the program had been far more extensive than anyone realized. Dozens of dogs had been subjected to experimental procedures designed to enhance their perception. Most had died, a few had survived, and at least one had made it to the Hürtgen forest. But there were also suggestions of something else. References to continued research, to facilities in other countries, to scientists who had fled before the war ended, taking their knowledge with them. The documents were classified at the highest levels and disappeared into government archives. Wheeler was ordered never to speak of what he had seen, and Sargent, the dog who had saved 47 lives and defeated an enemy that should not have existed, was quietly retired from military service. Wheeler took him home to Biloxi. They lived together for another 8 years, the man and his dog. Wheeler married a local girl named Martha, had 2 children, and opened a small feed store that eventually became one of the most successful businesses in Harrison County. He never spoke publicly about the war or about Sargent's abilities. When people asked about the dog, he simply said that Sargent was the best friend he had ever had. But sometimes, late at night, Wheeler would find Sargent standing at the window, staring out at the darkness, his ears moving in those familiar patterns, and Wheeler would wonder what the dog was hearing. What distant signals were still reaching him from a world that most humans could never perceive. Sargent died on a spring morning in 1953, peacefully, with his head resting on Wheeler's lap. The veterinarian who examined him reported that his cause of death was simply old age, but Wheeler knew better. His dog had been carrying damage from that day in the forest, damage that had slowly accumulated over the years until his extraordinary body could no longer sustain itself. Wheeler buried Sargent beneath an oak tree in his backyard. He did not mark the grave with a stone or a plaque, but every year on December 16th, the anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, he would stand beneath that tree and speak quietly to his old friend. "Thank you," he would say, "for everything." The story might have ended there, forgotten by history. Just another wartime tale lost to time. But in 1998, more than 50 years after the events in the Hürtgen forest, something happened that suggested the story was far from over. A researcher at the National Archives, working on a routine declassification project, discovered a box of documents that had been misfiled for decades. Among them was Wheeler's leather notebook, his meticulous observations of Sargent's behavior, and the classified reports about the German acoustic dog program. The researcher, a young historian named Dr. Caroline Mitchell, recognized the significance of what she had found. She began investigating, tracking down survivors, collecting testimony, piecing together a narrative that had been deliberately suppressed. And then she found something else, something that made her blood run cold. A memorandum dated 1947 from an office within the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency referenced continued research into acoustic perception enhancement in canines. The memo indicated that several German scientists who had worked on the program had been recruited under Operation Paperclip, the secret initiative that brought Nazi specialists to America after the war. The research had not stopped. It had simply changed hands. Dr. Mitchell's investigation went no further. Her security clearance was revoked, her research confiscated, and she was quietly encouraged to pursue other topics. The documents disappeared back into the archives, and officially, the matter was closed. But questions remain, questions that keep some people awake at night, staring at the darkness, listening for sounds they cannot quite hear. What happened to the German scientists who came to America? What did they continue to develop in the decades that followed? And are their dogs alive today in some secret facility that can perceive the world the way Sargent once did? Wheeler passed away in 1984, taking most of his secrets with him. But his daughter, now an elderly woman living in Mobile, Alabama, still has one of her father's possessions. A small leather collar, worn and faded, that Sargent wore throughout the war. Sometimes, she says, late at night, when the house is quiet, she hears something coming from that collar. A faint vibration, almost like a heartbeat, as if something is still listening, still waiting, still hunting in the darkness. She does not know what it means, and she is not sure she wants to find out. Some truths are better left buried, some secrets are meant to stay hidden, and some dogs, perhaps, never truly stop hearing the sounds of a war that ended decades ago. But this much is certain. In the autumn of 1944, in the death factory of the Hürtgen forest, a dog that everyone laughed at saved the lives of American soldiers by hearing what no one else could hear. He proved that there are forms of perception beyond our understanding, abilities that science is only beginning to explain. And he proved something else too, something more important than any military achievement or scientific discovery. He proved that loyalty, courage, and love can exist in forms we do not expect, that the bond between a man and his dog can transcend the ordinary limits of communication, and that sometimes the ones who see the world differently are the ones who see it most clearly. If you have watched this far, I want to leave you with one final thought. We live in a world full of mysteries, forces we cannot perceive, realities we cannot comprehend. It is easy to feel lost in such a world, easy to feel alone, but we are not alone. We never have been. There is a God who sees everything, who hears every prayer, every cry, every whisper in the darkness. A God who sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to show us that love is stronger than death, that hope is stronger than despair, and that no matter how dark the forest becomes, there is always a way through. Sargent found that way for his soldiers, not because he was trained to, not because he was ordered to, but because he loved them. And love, real love, finds a way even when all seems lost. May you find that same love in your own life. May you hear the voice that guides you through the darkness. And may you never forget that even in the worst moments of history, there were those who risked everything, human and animal alike, to protect the innocent and fight for what is right. God bless you. And God bless the memory of every soldier and every war dog who gave everything so that we might live in freedom. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay faithful, and keep listening. You never know what truths might be waiting just beyond the edge of hearing.